there is a particular kind of proof that requires the prover to risk his life. Not the proof of the laboratory, not the proof of the courtroom, not the proof of the debating chamber, but the proof that can only be offered at altitude, in a fighter aircraft, in contested airspace, against an enemy who is trying to kill you before you can demonstrate what you came to demonstrate. This is the proof that the United States Army Air Forces demanded from the men of the 332nd Fighter Group, whether it framed the demand in those terms or not. Prove that you can do this. Prove that the assumptions we built into this institution are wrong. Prove it in a way that cannot be disputed, in a context where the consequences of failure are immediate and final. They proved it. The institutional response to the proof was to limit the size of the classes. To understand what Tuskegee was, and what it meant, it is necessary to first understand what the United States military in 1940 believed about black men and flight. The belief was not informal or unexamined. It had been formalized in a War Department study produced in 1925, a document that surveyed what its authors characterized as the capacities of black soldiers, and arrived at a set of conclusions that were presented as scientific, and that were in fact, the institutionalization of prejudice in the language of pseudoscience. The study concluded that black men had smaller brains than white men, that they were incapable of complex technical learning, that they could not be socialized into the integrated structures of a modern military, that they were therefore unsuited to leadership, to skilled technical roles, and by direct implication, as aviation technology developed in the years that followed, to flight. This document governed the thinking of the Army Air Forces for 15 years. It was the institutional foundation on which every decision about black men and the military was built between the two world wars. When the question arose, as American rearmament accelerated in 1940 and 1941 and the black press, the Pittsburgh Courier, the Chicago Defender, the NAACP, demanded to know why black men could not serve in the Air Corps, the answer from the military establishment was rooted in this document, in the conclusions it had institutionalized, in the 15 years of policy that had been built on top of it. The political pressure was sufficient to force a response. The response was Tuskegee. The choice of location was itself a decision. Tuskegee Institute in Macon County, Alabama, was a historically black college in the Deep South, far from the northern cities where most of the political pressure was coming from, far from the concentrated attention of the national press, in a state where the full apparatus of Jim Crow was in operation, and where the failure of a black aviation program, if it came, could be contained. One of the officers involved in the decision said as much, in the specific candor that institutional racism sometimes produces when it believes itself to be among people who share its assumptions. If it doesn't work out, it'll be down south, and nobody will see them fail. The whole idea was that it would fail. The training program was, in its original institutional conception, less an attempt to integrate the Air Corps than an attempt to demonstrate, under controlled conditions, that integration was not possible. The men who arrived at Tuskegee to train as pilots in 1941 and 1942 understood this. They had come from every part of Black America, from northern cities and southern towns, from universities and farms, from professional families and working families, from every socio-economic register that black life in America occupied. They included men who would later become mayors and ministers and educators and businessmen. They included all American athletes, who had competed at the highest level their country would allow and found those levels lower than their ability warranted. They included men with degrees in mathematics and engineering and medicine, who had discovered that the civilian economy, no more welcoming than the military, had no interest in putting their training to use. The standards at Tuskegee were set deliberately high, higher, in multiple documented instances, than the standards applied at white training bases. The stated rationale was quality control. The operational purpose was elimination. Men were washed out of the program for offenses that had no counterpart in white training programs. for failing to say "sir" in the precise register that a particular instructor preferred, for wearing a hat at an angle that someone found inadequate, for attitudes that were categorized as disqualifying without reference to their flying ability. One man was washed out of advanced flight training and hired 2 weeks later as a flying instructor. The disqualification had not been about his ability to fly. Despite this, the program produced pilots, hundreds of them. The Washington establishment attempted to manage the output by limiting class sizes, by adjusting the washout criteria as the program's success became evident, by placing bureaucratic barriers in the path of every qualified applicant. The program kept producing pilots anyway, because the men who arrived at Tuskegee were, by the specific logic of the screening process that had been designed to exclude them, an extraordinarily concentrated group of the most capable, most educated, most physically fit young black men in the country. Jim Crow had produced, through its insistence on superhuman standards as a condition of admission to the inferior copy of the white program, something that the designers of those standards had not intended. It had produced an elite. They called themselves the Lonely Eagles. The name carried more than one meaning. Lowell Stewart had grown up in Los Angeles, a city with its own racial architecture, more fluid than Alabama's, but with the same foundational assumptions operating beneath the surface. He had attended integrated schools. He had played on an integrated basketball team. His teammates were his friends, and when the war came, and they all decided together that they would enlist in the Air Force, he went with them to the recruiting office. They were accepted. He was not. The recruiter did not know what to do with him, which was an honest statement of institutional confusion. There was no category for him in the existing system. 10 months later, after the category at Tuskegee had been created, and the political pressure had reached the threshold at which inaction became more costly than action, he was called. He was told to report to Tuskegee, Alabama. Alabama was a revelation of a specific kind. The revelation that the North's relationship to racial inequality was not an absence of that inequality, but a different geography of it. He had not been South before. He had not encountered, in the daily operations of his Los Angeles life, the formal apparatus of Jim Crow, the separate facilities, the separate entrances, the rules that governed which clothing could be tried on by a black customer, and which required purchase without trying, the rules that governed where you could eat, where you could sleep, what forms of address you were required to use, and which were forbidden to you. His wife in a clothing store in Alabama was told that if she put a hat on, she had bought it. He filed this. He filed everything. The filing accumulated. He graduated in the summer of 1942. He was sent overseas, first to North Africa, then to the Italian theater, where the 332nd Fighter Group was eventually assigned to the 15th Air Force and given the role of long-range bomber escort. The escort mission was the defining work of the 332nd. Heavy bombers, B-17 Souss and B-24 Souss, flying deep into German-controlled Europe, were vulnerable to fighter interception during the long transit portions of their missions, before and after the bomb run, when the formation had to maintain straight and level flight over defended territory. Escort fighters flew alongside the bomber formations, their role being to intercept the German fighters before they could reach the bombers. It was dangerous work. The escort fighters had to manage their fuel against the mission's duration, operate at altitudes and in weather conditions that pushed the limits of their aircraft and their own physical tolerance, and engage German pilots who were defending their home territory with the specific motivation that defense of home territory provides. The 332nd developed one of the strongest escort records in the Mediterranean theater, earning a reputation among bomber crews for discipline and consistency. While no escort group operated without loss, the 332nd's performance ranked among the best in its theater, and bomber crews increasingly requested them by name. The bomber crews, who flew those missions, knew the record. They requested the 332nd specifically. The men who had been assembled in Tuskegee to prove that black men could not fly were the most requested escort group in the Mediterranean theater. The German pilots they fought in those missions were not unaware of who they were facing. The 332nd flew with distinctive red-painted tail sections on their aircraft, a visual identification that became a marker of their reputation. A color that the bomber crews they protected looked for on the horizon and recognized as the presence of the group that had not lost a bomber. The Germans, who had been briefed that black men were inferior soldiers, encountered the 332nd in combat and filed their own assessment. The assessment did not match the briefing. The social architecture of their service did not match the combat record in any direction. The Isle of Capri was a rest camp in the theater, a place where aircrew were sent between combat rotations to recover physically and psychologically from the sustained demands of operational flying. It was off-limits to black pilots. When confrontations arose at USO facilities in the combat theater, in the literal theater of war, the confrontations were resolved in favor of the existing segregation. Someone eventually arranged a private rest camp in Naples for the 332nd. It was separate. It was not equal. These things, Stewart would say years later, mount up, one on top of another. They mount up. The officers' club incidents were the point at which the accumulation produced a formal confrontation. At Godman Field in Kentucky, and then at Freeman Field in Indiana, the specific mechanism of the officers' club, the social space that military protocol organized around the rank structure and which the segregated military had reproduced in miniature for black officers, taking one end of a barracks and putting a couple of chairs in it, became the site of a deliberate, organized act of collective resistance. Black officers arrived in groups at the White Officers Club. They were told they could not enter. They entered anyway. They were placed under arrest. Coleman Young, who would later become the mayor of Detroit, who was at the time a young officer at Freeman Field, described the mechanics of what followed with the clarity of a man who had thought through a legal and political problem carefully before acting on it. The commanding officer wanted the arrested officers to sign a document, acknowledging the order they had disobeyed. Signing would have made them subject to prosecution under the Articles of War. Young found the article that provided protection equivalent to the Fifth Amendment, the right not to incriminate oneself, and shared the strategy. 101 officers, called to sign the document one by one in alphabetical order, delivered the same response. "I'm sorry, sir, but under the 66th Article of War, I'm afraid this might incriminate me. I refuse to sign." 101 men, one by one, under a threat of severe court-martial and the full weight of military punishment in wartime. In the aftermath of the Freeman Field incident, the War Department issued new policy guidance that marked an early formal step toward dismantling segregation within the armed forces. The document acknowledged, in the indirect language of bureaucratic reform, what the events at Freeman Field had made impossible to deny, that the system as constructed was incompatible with the stated purpose of the war it was fighting. Stewart came home in 1945. He had flown combat missions over Germany, Romania, Austria, Hungary, and the Balkans. He had been part of the group that had not lost a bomber. He had a college degree and a teaching credential. He went to the school district that had promised him a job when he left for the service. He passed the new examination they required. They would not give him the job. He went to the Long Beach Municipal Airport, where he had the qualifications and the experience to fly with the Army Reserve Unit operating there. They told him, in the specific vocabulary of the period, that they did not have men of his race at that base. He attempted to purchase a house in Beverly Hills advertised for veterans. He had the financing and the qualifications. He was told he could not buy it. He became a real estate agent. He spent 30 years doing it. His stated reason, which he offered with the dry precision of a man who had been keeping careful records for a long time, was that he needed to find a good home for himself. Much of his professional work during those years involved finding neighborhoods and houses that black families could buy, navigating the covenants and the informal agreements and the various mechanisms by which the housing market had been organized to exclude the people he was representing. This was how he used his knowledge of the system's structure. This was the civilian application of what the war had produced in him. He said, "World War II has had a tremendous impact on black people as a whole. There have always been strides after every war. But after the war is over, they revert back to bigotry." He was not speaking abstractly. He was speaking from the specific evidence of his own life after 1945, the job that was not given, the airport that did not want him, the house he could not buy. The war had changed him, he said. It had changed Colonel Gleed, who stayed in the service for 30 years more. It had changed the 994 other black pilots of World War II, in whatever directions their individual lives took them after the shooting stopped. The proof had been offered. The proof had been accepted, in the narrow context in which it was offered. The combat record was not disputed, formal recognition followed, and the bomber crews who had requested the 332nd did not revise their assessments. In every other context, the proof encountered the same system it had been offered to disprove, which had simply continued operating while the proof was being assembled. Lowell Stewart counted his days, he said, one at a time. This was the statement of a man who had learned not to take the continuation of things for granted. He had watched the accumulation of evidence, the hat his wife could not try on, the rest camp in Naples, the officers' club at Freeman Field, the job not given, the house not sold, and he had filed it, one item at a time, into the larger account that the war had opened and that peacetime had not closed. He went back to Los Angeles and found neighborhoods where black families could live. This was the work. This was what the war had produced, not the story that the war's mythology preferred to tell about itself, the story of victory and vindication, and the proof accepted, but the longer, more complicated story of a man who had proved everything that was asked of him, and then come home to a country that had not finished asking. The red tails were visible from a long distance. The bomber crews who flew into the Rhineland knew what to look for. The record was clear, and it was not disputed, and it is still there, in the operational histories and the mission logs and the after-action reports. 200 missions, not one bomber lost to enemy fighters. The proof that was demanded had been offered in the only form that could not be dismissed. What followed was what always followed. He counted the days one at a time. He sold houses. He remembered